So in this class so far, we've talked about the climatology, climates on a rotating Earth, biomes, the fitness of the environment, the idea of ecological energetics, productivity and food chain dynamics, biogeochemistry. We finished a section on evolutionary ecology, genetics, evolution by natural selection, the modern synthesis, geographic variation. And now we're about to embark on a set of lectures on population growth and regulation. How populations grow, what are the models? We'll see growth with respect to exponential and logistic growth, and then we'll venture into competition, predation, and parasitism. And it will get more complex as time goes on. And you have to remember that a lot of this comes from the idea that nature, in all probability, a lot of the populations are really density dependent controlled. If you look at the world, it's pretty much populations exist at a quasi-steady state or nearly a steady state. They don't tend to boom and bust all the time. You'll often see the populations of deer are roughly the same, or the populations of squirrels are roughly the same. I'm talking about natural populations. I'm not talking about what we see, for example, with the coronavirus right now exploding out of control. So this goes back to this paper that we discussed earlier called Community Structure, Population Control and Competition, in which the argument is made that populations are limited by density-dependent biological interactions, and they're not density independent, so weather or other catastrophic events does not sort of basically control populations most of the time. Now, we're going to start using mathematical models, and I don't want you to freak out and panic about math, because it's really just symbolics. We're not going to do calculations for the most part, or anything we do calculate you could do on the back of an envelope, or you could calculate it in your head. But mathematical models are a way to understand a world that seems infinitely complex. If we just go out and describe the complexity, and we talk about nature and the beauty of nature and the complexity of nature, it's sort of semi-mystical thinking. And it's fine, but it's not going to allow us to make predictions. So what we need to do is take nature and put it into simple parts with models. The models obviously are an abstraction of nature. It's a very transparent process where we lay it out and let people peer review it. And they end up having predictive models. So this is what we're going to do. We're looking at this idea of trying to understand nature from a mathematical perspective with models that have some predictive value. And we're going to use various kinds of symbols. So it's going to be symbolic. It'll be very precise. There'll be some generality in it. And don't freak out when you see a to the x or a sub x or the square root of a or the sum equals a plus b. Don't just say, oh, I can't understand this and run away from it and be scared of it, because there's nothing to be scared about. So we've talked about populations as the unit of evolution. And now we're going to talk about the demography of populations, or we studied their vital statistics in a study we call demography. And for example, individual might have a height or a weight. Population, you might have a mean and variance, like a mean height or a mean weight and a variance around that. And so when we think about populations, we have birth rates and death rates, sex ratios, gene frequencies, growth rates, various kinds of statistical attributes of the population in general, not just the individual. And that's exactly what we're going to do when we get into talking about populations. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit, one of my favorite little books here by Larry Slobodkin. And I want to read you just a sort of opening chapter a little bit about this. One of the very first questions that may be asked about a population of animals is, how long do they live? The most facile answer is, it depends, which is really not at all satisfactory. The question of how long an animal lives is really a combination of several questions. It may mean the greatest age that can be attained by an animal of the species. For example, Heidegger reported the length of time of various zoo animals being kept in captivity. 50 years for male condor, 55 years for giant salamander, 30 years for bears, 20 years for lions and other big cats. Flower attempted to trace the authenticity of various accounts of extreme age in captive animals. He finds that some of these records admit of the possibility that a particularly beloved animal in a public menagerie may be replaced by an animal that is given the same name, and age at death of the substitute is given as the combined age of the original animal and the ringer. Jumbo's female companion, Princess Alice, who lived 157 years. The catch is, though, that sometime during her life she seems to have changed species, being born an African elephant and dying as an Asiatic elephant. And Jumbo himself had several ringers of this sort. More reliable estimates of elephants' age can give a maximum of about 67 years for Indian elephants and slightly less for African elephants. Two female tortoises, Testudo gracii, named Panhard and Daimler, were alive and still growing at the end of 39 years. And Heidegger reports vultures living over 100 years, a finding presumably based on a griffon vulture formerly in the private menagerie of Prince Eugene, Duc de Savoie, who was passed to a public menagerie after the owner's death and is reported to have lived 117 years. Public relations and nationalistic fervor make this record questionable. And I urge you to go watch the video or go to Wikipedia and see the work about Harriet the Galapagos tortoise, who was collected on Darwin's expedition to the Galapagos Islands. And the work that went into tracing Harriet's authenticity is rather fascinating. So when we talk about populations, the maximum age is rarely achieved in nature. A median age would be when half the animals are dead, but many animals have very high mortality when they're young. So we like to think in terms of like mean life expectancy, which would be the number of years lived by an average animal. In the simplest of all terms, the growth of a population is equal to the birth rate minus the death rate. Most populations that we look at have an age distribution, but what we're going to talk about now is how that age distribution comes around. And we're going to talk about, to do this, we're going to use a population which all members are born at the same time. This is what we would call a cohort. So the number alive at time 0, where L is the living survivorship. So we have LX at TX, say. So the number living, you think of survivorship at a particular time. So if we think of our cohort equals 100, we have 3 typical survivorship curves. We have a type 3, where constant proportion die each time period. Type 2, where constant number die each time period. Or type 1, where mortality is concentrated in older animals. And this looks something like this. If we plot these, essentially LX, the number alive at a particular time, relative to time or age. And you can plot the hypothetical cohort on the bottom to see how those 3 will work out. Or you can just look at these graphs where in type 3 we have very low survivorship when the animals are young. And these are things that have, say, like have pelagic larvae, or maybe dandelions that spew out thousands of seeds, or maybe oak trees that spew out millions of acorns. But as they get older, they have high survivorship. But they basically have the same constant. It's like maybe half of them die each time period or something. Type 2, where we have steady state survivorship, that's very indicative of birds, where the same number die each time period. And then we have this other one, very common in mammals, where there's relatively high survivorship until old age. So those are the 3 general types of survivorship curves that we see. And here's an example of 3 of them. We have Dall's mountain sheep, which is a mammal. It's a little bit of mortality when they're first born, and then they live a long time, and then they all drop dead. Birds have about the same chance of surviving at any age, and flowers and seed plants and animals that have pelagic larvae have very high mortality in the beginning. So nature is pretty messy, and we have a lot of complexities. Survivorship is not usually constant, and it can be different at different times or stages of the life cycle. For example, in birds, or there's the mountain sheep again, or insects are particularly interesting because each different stage of the insect's life cycle will have a different mortality associated with it. So like if you look over here at eggs and larvae and pupae and adults and reproductive, the same thing with these two species of moths where they have relatively high mortality as an egg, and then there's the larva and then the pupa, and then the adult goes along and then boom, drops dead. So it's never going to be perfectly fall into exactly one class. There's a little slop in nature all the time. But if you think about survivorship, it's actually the total number of animal years left for that cohort divided by the number of animals that are present at any one time. So if you look at these A, B, and C, you can think of from the dotted line, T sub x as the dotted line out, the total number of animal years left would be the area under what remains in the curve of the survivorship curve. So A versus B versus C, and you can see then that that gives you an idea of survivorship. And this is actually how insurance companies compute your insurance premiums. They have different curves, different survivorship curves for people with different health problems, and they can predict how long you're going to live, and the insurance company makes a bet with you. The insurance company bets that you're going to live that long, and you're basically saying, if I die, this money will go to my family. So that's survivorship. The next piece of this is fecundity. And I know if you read in the book, they talk about fecundity as F, symbolized by F. But in the real world of ecology, it's always been M. And MX then would be the fecundity at age X. And it's my personal belief that M is associated with maternal. So the average number of daughters each female will produce at age X. And that's because in almost every species, each female is replaced by one female in the next generation. And this is pretty much universal. Fecundity can also be thought of as the average number of individuals produced per individual in the cohort. So fecundity has an age function. It has an age distribution, just like survivorship. So for example, when an animal is first born or a plant first starts to grow, it's pre-reproductive. And then it reaches an age in which it is reproductive, and then usually as it ages, that reproductivity goes down, that fertility rate goes down. And it can be very age specific in many areas. For example, if you look at the age specific fertility rates of human women in 5 different countries, you'll see that it's very different. And you'll see, for example, that women in China tend to reproduce a little earlier than women in Haiti, but women in Haiti produce more, have a higher fertility rate than women in China or women in the United States. And you'll notice in India, there's a very early peak of reproduction. And the same thing in Kenya, where the onset of reproduction is relatively early and continues quite a while. So it varies, and this varies in animals in different habitats, varies with humans, varies with socioeconomic group, varies in many, many different ways. So, sort of like the woodchuck problem, we can calculate what's called the net reproductive rate sum. And by the woodchuck problem, I mean, how many chucks can a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? Chuck as many chucks as a woodchuck could chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood. So really what we want to know is how many animals are alive and how many of those, and what's the fertility rate or the fecundity rate of those animals. So for each age group, all right, what we would see is the number of young produced at each time interval by a female, and then we would sum that. Now, the example I've used here is a bird population, which the average female produces 1.8 young during her lifespan. She breeds in year 1 and year 2. She's dead at age 3. So half the birds are alive at time period 1, and the approximate number of eggs being produced per female is 2. So that would be LX times MX is 1. The number of animals alive times the reproductive rate. Year 2, we see that 20% of the animals are alive. They produce an average of 4 eggs. That's 0.8. And if we sum them up, sum LXMX, we get 1.8. And that's what we call R sub 0, which is called the net reproductive rate sum for a population. If R sub 0 equals 1, the population is stable. If R sub 0 is greater than 1, the population is increasing. And if R sub 0 is less than 1, the population is decreasing. So this gives us some feeling as to the reproductive rate and whether or not this population is increasing or decreasing relative to what it is in the previous generation. And again, there are complications. This happens to be a little bit of the LX and MX curves of a house louse, Pediculus humanus. This is the little creature that gets into your hair. And you'll notice that LX, starting at 1, when all the animals are alive, think of it as 1.0, slowly decreases in a linear fashion until about day 25 when it drops more precipitously. Where the eggs in the nymph are not reproductive, the MX schedule of the adult zooms up, gets really high, and continues until the animal dies. So what we're seeing is LXMX is that integrated area underneath, the sum of LXMX, and that's about 30.9. So this population obviously is expanding very, very rapidly. Now, if a population is allowed to develop in a constant environment, it will achieve what's called a stable age distribution. And that stable age distribution will be based on the LX-MX schedule for that particular population in that particular environment. So, in other words, the proportions of individuals will remain constant for generation to generation to generation. And that's what we would call a stable age distribution. But environments are really very rarely constant. So in nature, these quasi-stable age distributions exist. They're quasi at best. They're never going to be perfect because the environment's always changing. And so reproductive rates are going to change, survivorship's going to change. But they tend to hover around some sort of an age distribution that is characteristic of that particular species. And this is what age distributions look like for humans. And you'll notice, for example, in Mexico or the United States or France or India, and the age distribution will actually predict the future population growth of a particular species. For example, rapid growth in these age distributions that are very heavily weighted in young. We get into zero growth, we see that age distribution is pretty much linear up to middle age and then slow mortality. And then as populations get older and a little more industrialized, we often see the growth rate goes down, so we have fewer young than we'll see in the older years. So what we're ending up with is there are more people that are aged than there are young. And here's a little study of the United States in USA and the baby boomers. You know, the baby boom generation began when GIs returned from World War II, and right around 1946 to 1950 something, GIs returning started their families that had been put on hold. And so there were an excess number of young born. In 1985, those individuals were between the ages of about 15 and 35. And that's sort of around the time when fast food restaurants were really abundant, really came into vogue and grew very rapidly. And you can imagine a lot of families with a bunch of kids or young people not having time to go make food, started just grabbing food on the go. As the population aged, as those boomers began to move up in the population, they had a little more money that was disposable. And that's when we begin to see luxury cars like Acura and Lexus beginning to be produced by companies and beginning to sort of gain some traction. And now that group has moved up from 50s into the 60s, and a couple of things are happening. One, the baby boomers are reaching retirement. So we're going to get one of those top-end bulges that might strain the Social Security system. And that's where this graphic came from. On the other hand, we've seen much more high-end dining, again, because this group of this cohort has a higher amount of disposable income. And we also begin to see things like premium economy airline travel, or not so much business travel, first class travel, or we see cruises and people going on longer cruises and things like that. So as this baby boom generation has increased and has aged over time, what we'll see is that the economy is tracking them. And there's a very large discussion that's been going on in Congress for the last 5 or 10 years about death tax. In other words, we're going to see a very large amount of money roll over as a generational shift as these baby boomers begin to first retire and then later age out of the population. So the demographics drive a lot of the economy. Demographics are a function of the LX and MX schedules of populations. So that ends part 1 of the growth and regulation of animal populations. Simple demographics, where we've gone from survivorship, fecundity, calculating net reproductive rate sum, and then an examination of stable age distributions. Thank you.